Hello, good afternoon. This is Mary Coben from AHRI. We're just waiting for other folks to attend, so I'm going to go back on mute. Please bear with us as we're waiting for other participants to join our webinar. Hello, this is Mary Coben. Again, just letting everyone know that it is 3:58 on our calendar. We are not starting yet. We'll start in a few minutes. We are just waiting for more participants to join our webinar. Please join and bear with us shortly. Hello, and thank you for joining. We are just waiting for more participants to join. Please ask any questions for panelists in the Q&A box. Please bear with us. We are just waiting for more folks to join the webinar. Hello, and thank you for joining. We are just waiting for more participants to join our webinar. We will begin shortly. Hello, and good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We are just waiting for more folks to join our webinar. We will begin shortly. Hello, and thank you for joining. We are just waiting for more participants to join our webinar. We will begin shortly. Hello, and thank you for joining. We are just waiting for more participants to join. We will begin shortly. Hello, and thank you for joining today. We are just waiting for more participants to join our webinar. We will begin shortly, probably in about 2 minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining. We will be starting our webinar in about 1 minute. We are just waiting for the rest of the participants to enter the room, and then we will begin. Hello, and thank you for joining today. We are very pleased to have you join our webinar, HVACR equipment needed for the safe refrigerant transition. My name is Mary Coben. I'm the Senior Director, Regulatory Affairs. Nick, if you would go to the next slides, please. I've been with AHRI since February. I'm on the SRTTF, the Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. I'm currently on UL 60335-2-40, ISO 5149, ISO 817, the chair of ISO 817 Flammability Task Force. I'm on AHRI 34 and AHRI 62.2. I'm also the convener of IEC 60335-2-104, and I'm very pleased to be with you today. I'm also very pleased to present the rest of our panel today who will be speaking. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jason Ubrutz, Director of Industry Standards for ESCO Group. Jason comes to us with a great background working as the Director of Industry Standards and Relations for ESCO Group. He's a certified Master HVACR educator. He currently serves on numerous industry committees, including the AHRI Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force. He is co-author of Refrigeration and Air Conditioning Technology, the industry's leading textbook published by Cengage, as well as the author of the ESCO titles, Gas Heating and Low GWP Refrigerant Safety. Thank you for having Jason here today with us. The other participant I'd like to discuss today, review today, his background is Jeff Werther. He's the Training and Business Development Manager for Chemours. He has over 35 years in the HVACR industry. Jeff has previously worked as an HVACR technician, so he knows where you're coming from, a service manager, territory manager, product support engineer, product manager, and segment marketing manager. He previously worked for Kroger, Carrier, Danfoss, and Habegger Corporation. He has degrees in HVAC design and electrical mechanical engineering, as well as a bachelor's degree in business management. Jeff holds NATE certifications in both commercial refrigeration and air conditioning service. I want to welcome both of our participants today who are going to be talking about this great topic. Next slide, please. Thank you. Today, we're going to go over the regulatory background, kind of how we got here. Jeff will then go and talk about A2L refrigerant flammability, SNAP 23 approved refrigerants. Jason will then go and talk to us about A2L service procedures per UL 60335-2-40, service equipment overview, and then Jeff will come back and talk about service cylinders, and then I'll go back and go over the summary. So let's go to the next point. Why are we here? The American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. I think I've been having this seminar for several months now, this webinar, and I think most of you have heard about it, but just again to talk about the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. It requires a transition to lower global warming potential refrigerants. The AIM Act will actually reduce the supply of current higher global warming potential refrigerants. Today, 10 states already have individual low GWP refrigerant regulations. One of the things I think folks should recognize is there's really a likely AIM Act and safe transitions to low GWP refrigerants. Today, we already have plug-in appliances and light-duty vehicles that have low GWP refrigerants. Some expected transition dates are 2022 for commercial refrigeration, particularly in California, 2024 commercial refrigeration in Washington State, 24 chillers, 2025 residential and light commercial air conditioning, and probably the remaining commercial refrigeration will go over in 2026. Next slide, please. Let's talk about that transition, the new refrigerants. Many of the new low GWP refrigerants are AHRI A2L, and all of these new refrigerants must be approved by the US EPA through the SNAP process. EPA has to consider the safety, toxicity, flammability, and environmental factors before approving any new refrigerant. All flammable refrigerants are subject to additional safety requirements by EPA. These are called the use conditions. Again, as I mentioned before, EPA allows flammable refrigerants already in residential and light air conditioning since May 2021, smaller equipment, window units and PTACs since 2015, chillers since 2012, self-contained refrigeration actually has A3, higher flammability refrigerants, since 2012, and auto AC since 2011. Next slide, please. So the transition to low GWP refrigerants, what's the same? Well, hydrogen fluoride is a gas formed upon combustion of any fluorinated refrigerant. And oxygen deprivation is also possible when a refrigerant leaks out into a tight and enclosed space. We also know that frostbite is possible if I have leaking refrigerant or I touch an area near the valve and refrigerant comes out, and it's possible due to quickly releasing liquid refrigerant. So personal protective equipment, or PPE, should always be used by technicians and firefighters. What's different? Lower flammability and higher flammability refrigerants, A2Ls and A3s, will need to be used to comply with these new regulations. A2L refrigerants are characterized as having a low flame speed or burning velocity, less than 10 centimeters per second, and a low heat of combustion. And A3 refrigerants have higher flame speeds and higher heat of combustions. Now, what do I need to know if I'm servicing or working with A2L refrigerants? Well, I need to know that A2L refrigerants are difficult to ignite and have a slow or lower flame speed and have a low heat of combustion. However, I need to wear the proper PPE, so stakeholders such as myself need to be properly trained in the mitigation of risks due to lower flammability refrigerants. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Jeff. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mary. So some of you listening in today, you've lived through a major portion of this air conditioning refrigerant timeline that you see here. And excuse me, as we look to the right side of this green box, it's hard to believe that R410A systems were introduced in the mid-1990s, meaning we're approaching nearly 30 years of R410A systems being installed in North America. Now, for some of us that have went through that R22 to R410A transition, you remember the concerns of things like R410A having nearly 50% higher pressure versus R22. The differences between POE oils and mineral oils. R410A is a blended refrigerant, which introduced new terms like fractionation and glide. And we had to go out and buy a ton of new service equipment due to the higher pressures related to R410A. And then there's the concerns that we had over transporting and storing of these higher pressure refrigerants. So these are just a few of the learnings we had to go through on that R22 to R410A journey. So as we move from that green highlighted box and into the blue box, all of the concerns I just discussed, with the exception of some updated A2L service tools that Jason will talk about, these concerns are not there because the industry has already been dealing with things like POE oils. They will stay the same with this new journey. Higher pressures, the pressures which you'll see with these newer A2Ls are very similar to things like 410A. So a lot of the things that we've been dealing with in this nearly 30 years of R410A are what we're going to be dealing with the new refrigerants. So while this journey into that blue box of the HFOs and HFO blended refrigerants, it will require us to learn a few new things, but many of the best practices that a good contractor goes through will be similar to what we'll be doing in the future. So Nick, if you can go to the next slide. Like I said, Mary said, how do we get into this HFO journey on refrigerants? And well, we all know it's driven by the need to protect the environment. So there's guidelines and requirements typically start at like the international level. This is where the Montreal Protocol and Kigali amendments were established. Now, most of you know that the US has not signed the Kigali Amendment, which is generally agreement that the country is going to do something about curbing their CO2 emissions or in our case, reducing the HFC related emissions. And for the US, that action plan that would occur once we sign Kigali, so really we don't have to sign it. The action plan's already been put into place for this HFC phase down. And it's now in the hands of the EPA under what Mary showed earlier, what was recent legislation called the AIM Act. So the AIM Act supports the HFC transition in three primary ways. Like first, it establishes this HFC phase down, and it's at the federal level, which is what we all want. And that phase down will more than likely start January 1st of next year, January 1st, 2022. Second, this AIM Act will introduce HFC management plans for such things as refrigerant recovery or reclaiming. And then third, it will establish something called sector-based controls, which is what we'll show examples of in a few slides. Now, also within that federal bucket you see there shown on the slide, we will explain in more detail about EPA SNAP Rule 23, which is the list of approved A2L refrigerants for the air conditioning segment, as well as these rules for implementing the new lower GWP refrigerants into air conditioning equipment. Finally, since the AIM Act wasn't signed until late 2020, many states were taking their own initiatives in managing CO2 emissions by implementing their own HFC phase downs. And so in that far right box, it lists activities at the state level. Things like CARB, or if you've heard of the California Air Resource Board, has already established a few HFC phase down timelines. And then a group called the Climate Alliance, which also follows CARB's direction, or Mary showed earlier, roughly 10 states already have some things in place to begin their own phase downs. Now, we won't go into further detail on the state level activities within this webinar, because we hope that the individual state activities will cease as the details of the federal level EPA program is released later this year. So Nick, on to the next slide. So this slide shows some proposed GWP limits for certain equipment or applications. I mean, basically what this chart is saying is that a manufacturer or an installing contractor cannot utilize refrigerants with GWP values greater than what's shown in the middle column, specifically for that listed sector or segment that you see on the far left. But you can see that some of these transition dates are January 1st of next year. Now, many of the phase downs shown on this chart impact refrigerants like R404A or 507, which have a GWP value approaching 4,000. So thinking about it like this, like if you're going to install a new remote walk-in cooler, this application would fall into that second row and only permit refrigerants with a GWP of less than 1,500. So this is where instead of utilizing 404 or 507, the new refrigerants would be something like R449A or possibly R448A. Those could be utilized because they fall below that 1,500 GWP limit. And as you know, most of you know, like 448 and 449 have the same A1 AHRI classification as R404A and 507, which means like all the standards and codes are in place for this transitions listed on this slide to be able to easily be implemented January 1st of 2022. But if we go to the next slide is another segment in our industry, and it's proposed HFC phase downs impacting chiller applications. So let's go through an example. Like most of the comfort cooling or air conditioning applications fall into that very first row or category where that leaving fluid coming from the chiller temperature is above 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, these OEM designs will require that the refrigerant used in that new system have a refrigerant with a GWP value of less than 750. So If you recall, R410A has a GWP of around 2000. So comfort cooling or air conditioning chillers will need to find a refrigerant that has a GWP value of less than 750. Now, hold on to that GWP value for a second until we finish this slide, because you can see like other applications or segments within chiller designs, they may have different GWP values based on lower leaving fluid temperatures. You know, you can't use R410A in all kinds of chillers, but if it's, you know, we've looked at specific sectors and said that a comfort cooling or an air conditioning chiller currently uses a lot of R410A or scroll-based designs, and moving forward, they will need to have a design with a refrigerant of GWP of less than 750. So when we go to the next slide, this introduces SNAP, Rule 23. And so what I want to try to do is let's bring together SNAP Rule 23 and the slide that we just previously talked about and discuss that. So if you think about it this way, what does an R410A scroll-based chiller OEM do with their R410A designs? So first, they need to see what refrigerants the EPA will allow within that air conditioning segment. And SNAP Rule 23 establishes those refrigerants that can be utilized as what we call an alternative or substitute or acceptable for air conditioning applications. Now, all the refrigerants shown here on this slide have a GWP of less than 750, which is what the maximum value was on that previous slide for comfort cooling or air conditioning applications. Okay, now that the OEMs know what the maximum GWP value of a refrigerant can be, as well as what refrigerant the EPA will allow, well, you can figure it out. Right now, there's OEMs are out there designing their scroll-based or R410A chillers around refrigerants like R454B or R32. And this slide is why most of you guys are tuning into today's session, right? The refrigerants listed on this slide have an AHRI Standard 34 refrigerant classification of an A2L. So A2Ls cannot be dropped into an existing R410A piece of equipment. These refrigerants haven't been approved by the EPA, like Mary said earlier, subject to use conditions. And that's what you can see in that far right column where it says the decision. And these use conditions is what we'll talk about, requirements, whether it's out of UL 2-40, some different things like that. And then we'll talk about the associated tools that will be needed. So this is SNAP Rule 23. It lists the A2L refrigerants and it says they're acceptable subject to use conditions. So we'll try to balance these discussions between the A2Ls and what needs to be done to the equipment itself. If we go to the next slide, we just wanted to show, you know, these are the 6 listed refrigerants within SNAP Rule 23 and their comparison to R410A. And the reason we're transitioning again from 410A is listed in that row number 1, because that GWP of R410A is around 2000. As we've been discussing, many R410A designs will need a refrigerant with a GWP value of less than 750. And while we aren't talking about it specifically today, the air conditioning category will include equipment like residential split systems, rooftop units, along with the chillers that we showed, which means that stationary OEMs are also redesigning these R410A units with one of the refrigerants listed above. And like I say, as of today's webinar, the top 2 candidates for R410A replacement in the air conditioning industry seem to be shaking out around R454B as well as R32. All right, next slide. With over 500 people that have signed up for this webinar, it's possible that some of you, this may be your first AHRI Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force webinar. That's sometimes hard to say. But for this reason, we wanted to spend just a few minutes discussing how refrigerants are classified within AHRI Standard 34. So let's start with the chart on the right side. This is similar to what's shown in AHRI Standard 34. And as we mentioned, the EPA SNAP Rule 23 refrigerant options all have an A2L designation. But with many of our current refrigerants, all of those have an A1 classification, meaning it's a lower toxicity and they have no flame propagation within the AHRI testing procedures. However, for us to move to this lower GWP value in a refrigerant, let's utilize R410A as our example. So you can see R410A has two components, R125, which is classified as an A1 refrigerant, and R32, which is classified as an A2L refrigerant. Now remember, nearly 30 years ago, to make this R22 to R410A transition the least complex as possible, the percent of the two components were formulated to keep R410A as an A1 classification. Now, however, when we go to the next slide, if the goal of the new refrigerant is to have even lower GWP values, we'll use R454B as our next example. You can see if we want to lower that GWP value of the refrigerant, we begin increasing the flammability of the blended refrigerants by adding more of an A2L refrigerant percentage to the mixture, which is what you see in the composition of R454B. Both refrigerants are actually listed in AHRI as an A2L, which obviously makes the final composition an A2L as well. However, let's be clear, and Mary touched on it very lightly at the beginning, an A2L refrigerant is nowhere near the flammability of an A3 refrigerant like R290 or propane. So nearly a decade ago, AHRI created this new A2L category that you see here in yellow on the chart. And while the A2L designation has been around for a while, it hasn't really been discussed much because the refrigerants that we're talking about today haven't been utilized much. But as we move forward, because OEMs are going to be releasing more equipment beyond window units or self-contained units, it's important to make sure that the tools, as well as the installation or service practices for A2L refrigerants, is followed. So I think at this point, let me turn it over to Jason, who start discussing the standards addressing A2Ls, as well as the tools necessary for these new lower GWP refrigerants.
Thanks, Jeff. Good job there. One of the key standards that we're going to discuss is UL 60335-2-40, which is affectionately referred to as 2-40. It's a very large design standard, which incorporates several current UL standards, as some of those current UL standards will be sunset in the future. It covers many different types of HVACR equipment, some that you see listed here, and it allows for the use of A2Ls in specific applications. $7+ million of testing and research was conducted and used as information to develop these standards. Members have been actively reviewing this information and including it in standards, and members are currently reviewing the information to work on a 4th edition. We should note that in the annexes of 2-40, we have some very important service information. Annex DD provides information that's required to be printed in the manufacturer's literature, and Annex HH provides information required for those servicing or installing the equipment. Next slide, please. All right, what we're looking at here is a comparison of installation and service practices for A1 and A2L HVAC equipment. The newest standards only show 3 areas that will be required for an A2 installation that were not required for A1 systems. If we see there, the purge the circuit with an inert gas, evacuate, and leak test the unit, the 3 there on the right for the A2L. However, next slide, please. If we look at industry best practices, I would say most of the industry would agree that these requirements were things that should have been done with an A1 installation as well. from a best practices standpoint. Those technicians and contractors employing industry accepted best practices will notice little or no change at all in their service practices or their installation practices. Again, what's being required for these A2L systems that wasn't required before was already being done for the most part on these A1 systems. So there's not going to be that large of a difference between what you've been doing and what you've are currently or will be required to do in the future, as long as you've been, again, employing industry best practices. Next slide, please. Shown here, we're looking at the service tools. It's important to point out that you as technicians and contractors, as you begin buying your newer HVAC tools, things like scales won't change. However, things like recovery machines or vacuum pumps and other tools that are listed here, it would be best to verify that they're A2L capable moving forward so that the industry transition can be a smoother process. Again, if you have an arsenal of recovery machines and as you have to replace them one at a time over the next few years as the transitioning is happening, it would be beneficial to you to ensure that it's A2L rated so that moving forward when the transition takes place, you're already set up for it. Next slide, please. A cursory search of the internet found that many different options for A2L compatible service tools and equipment are already there. So what should you be looking for? You should make sure that the equipment is intended for use with A2L refrigerants. Many equipment and component manufacturers will note what standard and equipment it has been listed to. When in doubt, check with the manufacturers. Many OEMs are preparing for the change, so make newer purchases, make sure that they are A2L compatible. As you can see listed here, some of the things that, again, came up in a simple Google search: refrigerant recovery equipment, vacuum pumps, leak detectors, gauge manifolds, and other service tools. Next slide, please. AHRI created a survey inviting manufacturers to respond and provide information about equipment that can be used with A2L equipment. Some of the results are listed here. These results are not comprehensive representation of what is currently available. They're a course view intended to show you that A2L tools and equipment are already available. If you're a manufacturer and you want to participate and have your products added to the survey results, you can follow the link shown on your screen. In the search, we found, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes. All right. Shown here is the website, the SRTTF AHRI Safe Refrigerant Transition Task Force website. Listed on the website is a list of these survey results, a list of the A2L tools and equipment. You can visit the AHRI Safe Refrigerant Task Force website. Under the Resources and Fact Sheets heading, there is a link labeled A2L Equipment. Click on the link to download a short PowerPoint deck which contains links to the A2L tools and equipment. Next slide, please. The HFO molecule helps break down refrigerant much quicker, which equates to a lower GWP. SNAP 23 listed certain conditions where an A2L could be utilized for air conditioning or direct systems. A direct system is one in which the refrigerant coil is in direct contact with the occupied space, for example, a residential evaporator coil. OEMs and codes must follow the latest UL or AHRI standards, some of which are listed here, which include A2L conditions. It should be noted that several states have already adopted these into their state codes. Indirect systems like a chiller in a basement have also updated guidelines for A2L refrigerants. We have to make sure that first responders are informed of the differences between A2L and A1 systems. The NFPA now has updated flammable refrigerant programs, which include A2Ls. Can you advance it one a little bit? Thank you. Industry training organizations have released A2L technician training programs as well. Also required will be additional labels, which will soon appear on the units to alert contractors to the additional precautions that need to be taken when servicing A2L equipment. You can see the ISO flame symbol. The bottom line is many parts of the industry are coming together to ensure that we have a safe transition. With that, I would like to hand the presentation back to my colleague, Jeff.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot, Jason. Yeah, so let's continue on talking about what's the same and what's different from an A1 to an A2L refrigerant. So as contractors replace their old equipment, they should be purchasing new equipment that will work not only with the current A1 refrigerants, but also with these new A2L refrigerants. So I want to spend some time on the other components beyond what Jason had shown and what you'll see on that AHRI website. You know, we've done a lot of work to show, you know, vacuum pumps, recovery machines, and all those type of things. But I wanted to go into discussing cylinders themselves, both the disposable as well as the reclaim or recovery cylinder. So let's start with the disposable refrigerant cylinders first. And you can see on the left side of the slide that the cylinders will be the same rated pressure as the current R410A cylinder. So remember I said we had to go from R22 to 410A and there was a lot of things changing. The cylinders will not change from 410A to the new A2Ls listed in SNAP Rule 23. The difference is that the A2L cylinder will have a pressure relief valve, which, like in the event of a cylinder seeing too high of a pressure, this relief valve will only release enough refrigerant to reduce the pressure in that cylinder, and then it'll reset. Versus the current R410A cylinder has a rupture disc, and we all know that rupture disc means if the R410A cylinder is overpressurized, then that rupture disc pops and it releases all the refrigerant. So that's one of the things that are different. And you can see in the picture in the circle on the right side that this is a pressure relief valve. And so like I say, if it ever got too high of a pressure, all it's going to do is open up and then reset, only releasing a little bit of the A2L refrigerant. If we go to the next slide, you may have recently seen some of your refrigerant purchases are now in gray cylinders. So this was something that was actually recommended over a handful of years ago in AHRI Guideline N, and it was supposed to take effect January 1st, 2020. Now, before I leave this slide and explain why the industry is going to all gray cylinders, I wanted to highlight the other differences between an A1 like R410A and an A2L. And that visual difference is that the A2L cylinder will either have a red band or the entire top of the cylinder will be red. And that's what we're trying to show here, A1 versus A2L. If we go to the next slide, like I said I wanted to explain the reason for the change to all gray cylinders, and I thought one of the best ways to do it was to have a short game called Name That Refrigerant. So if you go to the next slide, if you've ever seen AHRI Guideline N, it has a ton of pages listing the specific color associated with that ASHRAE 34 designated R value. And so now off to the left is 7 refrigerants, what I tried to capture like all in the blue category. And while I'm sure some of you could identify some of those refrigerant colors, I would say that many of us couldn't identify all of them. And we move to the next slide. So the point of having a blue cylinder, if you still have, what's the use of that if you still have to look at the specific R designation of the cylinder box? Because you can see the first two right there, 134A and 32 are quite different refrigerants for different applications, but you can see how slight difference there is in the cylinder color. And so while many of the folks will remove that cylinder from the carton, refrigerant manufacturers have always wanted the industry to keep that refrigerant in that box because there's important safety information on that box. So if everyone follows the proper procedure and keeps that refrigerant cylinder in the box, having a gray cylinder isn't going to negatively impact the industry. Besides, as the boxes on the left of this slide show, we're running out of colors. I mean, you can see just a slight difference between 134A cylinder and R32. So if a manufacturer has not yet gone to gray cylinders, I would expect as new refrigerants are released, they will be releasing the products in a gray cylinder. So my best suggestion is to keep that refrigerant cylinder in the box, and the gray color won't matter. All right. So if we move back into the next slide, if we continue on disposable cylinders, like I say, the current A1 refrigerant cylinders have a right-handed thread on them. And I think there was a question that popped up about why RH, and that's the current fittings that you see on A1 pieces of equipment or most of your gauges right now. But to make sure that the technicians understand they're dealing with an A2L refrigerant, these cylinders will more than likely have a left-handed thread on them to gain access to the refrigerant. And I know some people might argue that the field might buy an adapter, which could happen, but at least it's another step that the technician has to take, which reminds them that they're dealing with a different type of refrigerant. So like I say, this is where we see the refrigerant cylinders heading, is that A1 refrigerants will have that 1/4 inch flare, but it'll be a right-handed thread. A2L refrigerants will stay with that 1/4 inch, where it'll be a left-handed thread design. Continuing on to the next slide, when we're handling disposable A2L cylinders, let's quickly walk through what needs to be done. You know, don't try to pressurize a disposable cylinder, right? Don't place cylinders near flames or heat sources. Definitely don't mess with that relief valve. Obviously, don't abuse the cylinder, right? If we move down farther on the list, any 400 series refrigerant should be removed from the cylinder in the liquid form. We want you to open that valve slowly, and by all means, dispose of the cylinder properly. I mean, now that we've gone through this list, guess what? If we advance to the next slide, it's all the same for A1s and A2Ls. So once again, there's nothing new. The only thing that would be different is if you looked in guideline, I think it's Q or G, the picture's kind of hiding it right there. Instead of an A1, you would try to remove the rupture disc. Well, obviously you're not going to be able to remove that pressure relief valve. So the process is to make sure that the cylinder is empty, and then pierce the cylinder with a tool so that it can't be reused. So bottom line, the safe handling, all those things are the same between an A1 and an A2L. It may be that the only difference is that when it's at the end of the use, an A1 you would remove or puncture the rupture disc. On an A2L cylinder, you would actually use a tool and puncture the side of the cylinder itself. Moving on to the next slide, when we talk about the recovery of the refrigerants, you know, we just want to make sure that, you know, as you use this, as you move to the new refrigerants, that the recovery machines and the cylinders are capable of A2L refrigerants. And like I say, if you go out to that, our website or the AHRI's website, you know, you'll see there are a lot of component manufacturers for recovery machines and vacuum pumps and even gauges now are already capable of these A2L refrigerants. So as your equipment wears out and you go to buy a new recovery machine, make sure that it is A2L compatible. And once again, though, the procedures shown on this slide are the same as what every contractor should be following with both an A1 as well as an A2L refrigerant. On to the next slide. Jason said something on one of the slides talking about 2-40, and it said it was mentioned there may be additional labels on the air conditioning unit. So for me to discuss what's going to be additional, let's focus on, say, a residential split system air conditioning application. Now, as most of you know, a residential split system unit, condensing unit, comes with a factory charge. And in that factory charge is capable of handling like a certain length of line set, as well as a matching indoor coil. But in some cases, it will be necessary to add refrigerant to cover for, say, a longer line set. And while it's always been a best practice to capture how much refrigerant was added or what the total refrigerant charge is, it now will be a requirement. And I'll explain why in just a second. So technicians will also be required to capture things like the values of what they did when they did a pressure test, where you saw where Jason showed earlier, it was recommended for an A1 refrigerant. It's going to be a requirement for an A2L. But once again, these are all the best practices that should have been done with A2Ls, and now will just become a requirement for an A1. So I like to think of what we're doing in the industry again is getting back to the basics, right? That's what I taught almost 30 years ago when we introduced R410A. If we get back to the basics, the installations and the service and everything will go a lot smoother. The next slide, what I'm talking about here is the reason it's important to capture that complete charge of an A2L refrigerant is because the OEMs, Jason mentioned that, 2-40, it's going to be all on the OEMs to provide the information and the installation instructions and to make sure that everything's done right. So depending on the total charge of the system, it will guide the installing contractor or the technician as to certain procedures based on that total refrigerant charge. So, I said we're going to be learning a few new things. There'll be some terms like MC, which is the total charge, or M1, which is a certain condition, or M2. These things are all going to be discussed in the OEM's instructions. And what it might do is lead to additional mitigation strategies that might need to be incorporated into the system. But once again, guys, think about a current R410A system. If you go over a certain length of line set piping, sometimes people refer to as like a long line application, maybe like on a commercial application where a split system's used, but you're doing 150 feet of line set. You would be required by the OEM to add things like solenoid valves or crankcase heaters. And those things are put in to prevent refrigerant migration. Now, in the case of an A2L refrigerant, it's all about mitigation of the refrigerant from ever getting to a flammable concentration. So knowing exactly how much is the total refrigerant charge, not what just came from the manufacturer, but what the total refrigerant charge of the system determines these mitigation strategies. And so once again, the OEMs are going to guide you and say, hey, up to this much pounds of refrigerant, you only need to do this. And it may be that the mitigation strategy is already implemented in the equipment. If it smells refrigerant, turn on the blower. That blower will dilute the charge and you will never make it to that flammability limit. So those are the kind of things, but it's going to be important that the technician or the installing contractor captures that total refrigerant charge and make sure that it's not just turn on the blower. It might be turn on the blower as well as introduce fresh air or additional ventilation. So those are the kind of things. But once again, the OEM is going to walk all the contractors in that through these type of things. But once again, it's back to the basics. We would be capturing and putting these things down or pressurizing systems if we're doing the right things for R410A as well. As we near the presentation, the next slide, it's talking about, you can see here, and depending on maybe your municipality or your cities have adopted certain I codes like the International Mechanical Code or the International Residential Codes. Some of these things may require locking caps. I mean, I actually have a brand new house and it's an A1 refrigerant and it has locking caps on it because of the local jurisdiction requires that. So what will happen with A2Ls will actually have a couple of options. Like I say, it's listed in the standards to gain access to that refrigeration system. Either that system will have locking caps like are shown here to prevent access to the service ports, or It could be that the OEM would design the equipment that the service ports are not accessible without removing a service panel. So these are some of the things that, like I say, the majority of the equipment's going to look very similar, but suddenly you may see that you cannot access service ports without removing a panel. And that will qualify as one of the things, one of the safeguards for an A2L refrigerant versus an A1. On to the next slide. I think, you know, when we're talking about whether it's an A1 or an A2L, the most important bullet point on this slide is that first one. And, you know, verify that the recovery refrigerant is what the label on the returnable cylinder says it is. You know, this again is going back to the basics. You use a pressure temperature chart and a set of gauges to verify what's in that cylinder. But make sure you label it, and then you can see the difference between an A1 cylinder, all gray, versus an A2L. Like I say, you either have a red band, or in this case, it's showing a completely red top, which is what you want the A2L refrigerant to be in. Next slide just talks about the same thing or applies to the returnables. You know, the only difference is that red band across the top, or the entire top of the cylinder will be red, but you'll need to make sure you mark and label what refrigerant is in it. So hopefully everyone sees there's a theme here to this transition from refrigerants like R410A to new A2L or low GWP refrigerants like R454B or R32, but it will allow the industry to get back to the basics while incorporating just a few new procedures or new tools. So I think with that, I will turn it back over to Mary, and she'll follow up with a summary.
Oh, thank you, Jeff and Jason. Really appreciate your overview today. And let's kind of go through where we've been and what we learned today. So again, just to repeat again, the U.S. is transitioning to low GWP refrigerants. Many of these are A2L type refrigerants, and the change is being driven by regulatory landscape. As Jeff noted, there's international one, but what we're really focusing on here today is the U.S. AIM Act, and that's really driving some of that change. And there are already six U.S. EPA SNAP listed refrigerants. I think that's really, you know, showing us that the industry is moving forward. The U.S. EPA has use conditions for these refrigerants. We have them marked out in the slide deck today. Most important one, I think, is that these are listed for the use conditions as it's listed for new equipment. You need to follow UL 2-40, and you need to follow proper labeling and handling. So these are the big themes we've been sharing with folks. The industry has also been preparing for the transition to low GWP refrigerants, and A2L service information is absolutely available. In most cases, as we showed today, the A2L refrigerant will be handled very similarly to A1 refrigerants. We're asking technicians and industry stakeholders to review that new information. And when there's any doubt, always refer to the manufacturer's literature and local authority having jurisdiction to answer your questions. Next slide, please. One of the other things we were really happy about and really appreciated, and I also want to mention it again, is that there's A2L service equipment is available. AHRI did a survey. We found that there are definitely refrigerant recovery pumps, vacuum pumps, leak detectors, and gauge that's all available for A2L equipment. AHRI looks forward to people sending us information if they want to have their information shared with AHRI and get it on that website. Again, want to let you know it's there. And I think Jason did a great job showing everyone where it's at. A2L service cylinders that are disposable will be very similar to A1 cylinders. And I think folks went through and showed that again today. The A2L refrigerants will also use the 4BA, 4BW DOT 39 cylinders for the disposable. Cylinder markings, as Jeff shared with everyone, are really, we should start seeing people starting to see that gray. They're going to follow AHRI guideline N. A2L service cylinders will have a red band. They'll have a PRV, pressure relief valve instead of a rupture disc, and they may have a left-hand valve fitting depending on where the industry goes. I think those were shown today. And A2L recovery cylinders will again be very similar with minor differences. I think Jason brought out the industry is still kind of on the fence there a little bit, and Jeff also brought that out. Industry is still a little bit on the fence, whether it's going to be a label or a band or a red top. But again, best practice will be to mark so that you always know what's in there. And that was the practice from years ago, is to always mark what's in your recovery cylinder. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for attending today's webinar. I think we are going to open the floor and start answering some questions. I think Helen and Nick have been taking note of some of the questions. Some were answered live. So Helen, I would defer to you if you found some of the questions to start the discussion point. Let me.
Hi, Mary. Do you want me to go ahead and read some of these off?
Yes,
and
please.
Okay. Yep. There's a question about the pressures for 410A. So one question is, if the pressures will be very similar for 410A, how do you check to tell whether a system is using 410A or 454B? So how would somebody know if they come up to a system and need to maintain it, which refrigerant is being used?
Jeff, you want to take that one, or Jason?
Yeah,
How
no,
about
I
Jeff?
mean, I think, you know, from a perspective, it's critical on the PT charts. You'll see that R410A and R454B, while their performance and a lot of things are very, very similar, there is a slight difference between an R410A pressure temperature, say like at 40 degrees evaporator or 95 degrees condensing. There's a slight difference between the two. So, you know, having a good set of gauges and knowing how to utilize a PT chart or have a good PT app on your phone should help, you know, clarify that. Now, I mean, there also should be a rating plate on the unit, right?
Yeah, Jeff, I was going to say the labeling that's required. 410A is an A1 and 454B is an A2L. And
So
these A2L systems will have, you know, the ISO flame symbol, and they will have the stickers and things on there, the labeling that's required for these types of systems.
Yeah. So you should never see a mismatch. You're supposed to, whatever AHRI classification, if it's an A1 system, it should stay with an A1 refrigerant. If it's an A2L, it should stay in A2L. But then if you believe somebody may have tried to do it, there is a slight difference in the PT charts, and you hopefully should be able to look at it from that perspective.
Great, thank you guys. Next question?
Yep, there's another question. Is there an A2L vacuum pump or other equipment and tools that is compatible with A3 refrigerants as well?
You know, I'm going to answer this one that honestly, I'm sure there probably are. I don't know what we looked for particularly during our equipment service. What people shared with us were A2L service equipment, because that was the focus of today's webinar. So I think folks would have to look at the information on our website and see if it's available. And that might be something that we would look at for a future webinar. Jason or Jeff, I mean, I'm sure there probably is, correct? But I don't particularly know what we had listed on that equipment survey, if there was any crossover units, correct?
And I was going to say, yeah, as I reviewed or went out and looked at, you know, the listing of those type of things, one or two may have said A2L/A3, because it's really more about maybe it's a brushless motor, or maybe it's got more air going across it. So you may be able to find a recovery machine or a vacuum pump or something that would be capable of both an A2L as well as an A3, but it will be some research on your end to look and find, you know, it's going to be a much fewer than just an A2L recovery machine. Is much more prevalent.
Yeah, and I think that had to do with, you know, I do apologize. That was the focus of our webinar today was A2L service equipment. So that was kind of how we, envisioned the survey. Next question, Helen.
Sure. There's a question. There's a couple questions about phase out date. Well, let me ask some more equipment questions first, and then we'll ask about some of these phase out dates. So there's a question whether we will need different gauges and hoses for the different A2Ls. So example, do you need one set of gauges and hoses for R32 and then a different set for R454B?
So I would like Jason or Jeff to answer those, if you guys would.
That would depend on the manufacturer and what they list it to. As far as the codes and standards of things are concerned, they must be rated for use with an A2L refrigerant, but the individual manufacturers would list then which refrigerants the gauges are certified for use with.
Right, right. So especially like if you look at the digital gauges, you can already go out there and see that, one set of gauges is capable of both R32 as well as R454B. And so, if you, purge or clean the hoses, from the previous job, if you were on an R32 job and now you're going to an R454B job, just, make sure that the hoses are evacuated or don't have any refrigerant in them, and you could use it. It's not like the oils are going to be, entirely different or anything. And if you look at 454B, it's roughly 70% R32. It's just got 1, 2, 3, 4 YF added into it to get that lower GWP value. So it's not going to be a problem to be able to use it on the multiple refrigerants listed in SNAP Rule 23.
Okay, great.
Mary, I know we only have a couple minutes left. I'm going to try to get a couple more questions in here.
Sure.
Can empty cylinders be fitted with the pressure relief valve?
No, that's one I would easily take on that because really those pressure relief valves are designed at the manufacturer, and trying to post fit is not a good idea for various reasons. So, those come the way they are, if that makes sense to folks. Those disposables come the way they are manufactured directly from the manufacturers.
Great, thanks, Mary. Do we have maybe time for one more?
Sure.
Okay, so maybe just one more. I know we're out of time. There's a couple questions about phase out dates. So there's a question about a phase out date for residential split air conditioners, and there's also a question about a phase out date for commercial refrigeration refrigerants with a GWP greater than 1500. And if maybe let the panel answer, and then if you need me to step in, I'm happy to help with that as well.
Yeah, Helen, I'm going to say Jeff or Jason may be closer to that than I am, or you. I'm not. I'm watching the industry, but I'm more on the sideline.
Yeah, and I would have to say that as of right now, the EPA has until late September to establish some of those sector-based numbers. So I would say if EPA follows CARB is proposing a January 1st, 2025 date for the residential and light commercial equipment, basically our 410A scroll-based products. Will the EPA follow that same guideline for the whole federal thing? We don't know yet. We have a pretty good feeling that it will be that date and time, but we won't know 100% until later in September timeframe for, I would say, both the questions asked, both the air conditioning as well as the commercial refrigeration. Is CARB has kind of been leading the way. They have some guidelines for it, but the EPA still, we don't know the exact timelines or GWP values, but we have an idea. And so stay tuned until the end of September. Maybe we'll have another webinar on those exact dates.
It will be in the SRTTF newsletter. If you subscribe to the newsletter, when that ruling does come down, we will put something in the newsletter.
Good point.
And in case anybody's unaware, if you don't mind me adding, Mary, this is Helen Walter-Tierney. I'm the VP of Regulatory Affairs at AHRI. We did request a 2026 date from EPA for commercial refrigeration below 1500 to delay that some to allow the standards and codes to kind of get caught up nationally. And then, we certainly hope that there will be alignment across the country around that 2025 date with, nothing sooner. So if that's helpful. Mary, I know we're out of time.
Yep.
There are a number of good questions here, and I think we're going to have to circle back around and contact some of these folks afterwards. So
Yes, no, we really appreciate it. Sorry, folks. We see we're over time for today's webinar, but again, we wanted to say thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, big thank you to Jeff and Jason for being our presenters today, and really appreciate everyone's time. And this session will be recorded and posted. Unfortunately, I can't say exactly when. We've just been inundated with other items, so we will try and get this posted shortly. So keep looking back at our SRTTF website for more information. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yep, take care.